They opened a P-38’s twin engines and realized they had not captured an airplane. They had stumbled into America's secret weapon. That is the promise of this story, and by the time you hear what was hiding under those cowlings, you will understand why a single intact Lightning at Guidonia felt less like a trophy and more like a telegram from the future. But why did a shape Italians mocked as the twin-tailed devil become the moment an engineer conceded a war in his notebook? Because the wrong airplane landed in the right sunlight. Guidonia Airfield, Rome, June 1943. The Mediterranean heat wavered above the tarmac as engineer Capo Filippo Zapata paced around the gleaming intruder, pencil tucked behind his ear, sweat stinging his eyes, measuring tape snapping against metal. He had studied Spitfires and Yaks, put calipers to Messerschmitts, and told himself he knew what the nations of 1943 could build. Then he touched the Lightning. Up close, the twin booms were not ungainly. They were inevitable. The first brush was not with speed or firepower, but with philosophy. Everywhere Zapata looked, he saw a design born in a land that feared shortages less than it feared failure. Radiators tucked into the wing roots without drama, access panels that opened with a quarter turn and revealed wiring looms laid like music, connectors labeled in clean stenciling as if a ground crew chief in California had whispered instructions across the ocean. Even before the cowlings cracked, he felt the chill. The Americans had not built a fighter and then made it rugged. They had built a rugged machine and then dared it to fight. And that is when the dread arrived. He could measure rivet spacing and wing chords. He could not measure the distance between Italian scarcity and American abundance, only feel it widening with each click of his tape. The left cowling released on its latches and swung away with the weight of a vault door. Silence fell, the kind that moves in with awe. The Allison V-1710 did not look exotic, just exact. Cylinders marched in perfect ranks. Fluid lines bent in confident arcs, and aft, nested like a secret, the turbocharger gleamed with the sheen of metal that had been asked to live inside fire and learned how. Zapata did what engineers do when shock threatens to turn them into spectators. He named things: turbine housing, wastegate, intercooler duct. He traced the path of exhaust from manifold to turbine, felt with gloved fingers the smoothness of a casting that spoke of sand cores made by hands that had done this 1,000 times. The turbine wheel itself was small, almost modest, and that modesty felt like a taunt. Make me. Go on. Try. Beside him, Giorgio Mancini exhaled a question without a verb. What alloy? Zapata did not guess. He measured the thought instead. It was not simply the chemistry, it was a national habit of precision, a way of promising performance at altitude and then keeping the promise. In his notebook he wrote a sentence that was not numbers. If they can put this into every engine, the sky over 20,000 feet belongs to them. He should have felt anger. What he felt was the edge of truth, cold and smooth, sliding against the palm. This aircraft had crossed an ocean, flown north by mistake, and arrived to tell Italy a fact that could not be argued with. Fact looks like redundant pumps and mirrored gear trains, like counter-rotating props that cancel torque, because why fight physics when you can engineer it into silence? Fact looks like ammunition feed motors that do not jam just because a pilot asked the plane to turn hard at the wrong moment. He could not yet see the whole shape of the disaster. He could feel its weight in the gear teeth. He told himself to begin with what he could count. He counted anyway, and the counting betrayed him. Not the big boasts everyone throws into a briefing, the invisible arithmetic that lives in margins. How many man-hours to teach a factory to build cores for radiators that do not leak under stress? How many gauges and blocks to hold a gear while it is cut and heat-treated until it both sings and refuses to scream. How many pairs of hands that do not guess at tolerances, because tolerances are not guesses? He tried to imagine building one perfect copy. He let himself be generous. 6 months. The best machinist pulled off every other task. Work that would starve squadrons to feed a single engine. That engine, if it ran, would run like an only child, brilliant and unrepeatable. War does not reward miracles you cannot make again tomorrow morning. Zapata closed the notebook and opened the other cowling. The right side was a mirror, and the mirror was the lesson. It is not hard to make a wonder once. The wonder is duplication without drama. He studied the mirrored reduction gears, the reverse-handed threads, the twin prop governors tuned like a duet. At the root of the wing, he found the radiators and their armor, the pathways of coolant and oil that spoke of a designer with a list of ways a pilot could die and a stubborn refusal to let any of those ways be the easy way. He saw redundancy everywhere and felt a pang of envy so sharp it felt like pride in someone else's work. Italians cut weight with courage. Americans spent weight like a budget to buy certainty. This is what a nation builds when it can tell its engineers yes more often than it tells them no. When the chief test pilot arrived the next morning, he wore the same confidence all veteran flyers wear around unproven machines. Angelo Tondi listened to Zapata with the patience of a man who had landed hot and long and sideways in every airframe his country had ever flown. The tower windows rattled when the Allisons woke in sequence, a bass note that settled into a hum with no stray beats. Taxi. Pause. Throttles forward. The takeoff roll felt like a ship gathering itself, and then the lightning climbed and did not seem to tire of the idea. When Tondi returned, he stayed seated long enough that the ground grew nervous. He descended from the cockpit with a look that had lost an argument. He did not reach for metaphors. He reached for the simple truths pilots respect. At 25,000 feet it kept breathing as if the air was still thick. It answered the stick with weight, but not reluctance. It showed him a gun sight that made math unnecessary. When he fired, the sky in front simply lost the argument. Zapata did not gloat. He asked the only question a responsible engineer asks when pride becomes expensive. Can we counter it? Tondi glanced at the airplane as if it might overhear betrayal. Not with what we have, not where this war is being fought now, in the cold altitudes above the bombers. He did not need to list production numbers or shipping schedules. The Lightning had already done that with its existence. A machine like this asks a country to build everything around it. Spare parts that arrive before they are begged for. Fuel that reaches forward fields because a logistics officer had a plan that survived first contact with mud. Tools that fit without filing. Manuals that tell a 19-year-old how to find a fault, and the fault waits politely to be found. In the weeks that followed, the captured Lightning flew against Italian fighters and did what fear and fascination had already predicted. It chose when to fight. When it did fight, it made range a weapon and made convergence irrelevant. It revealed an American habit of overbuilding that, when married to power, turned damage into inconvenience. It convinced no one who mattered in time. Reports climbed and were filed. Engineers learned what they could and then stared at factory floors that could not learn it fast enough. On a single August day, Tondi took it to war and won a narrow victory that made for a headline and changed nothing else. Soon the Lightning sat, an immaculate warning with no spare parts, a machine designed to live inside a network, and now marooned without one. Months later, Italy surrendered, and whatever happened to that airframe after the papers changed hands does not change what it had already done. It had made Zapata write the sentence he would remember for the rest of his life. We are not losing to an airplane. We are losing to the ability to make so many of them that even the mistakes arrive perfect. Years later, when the noise of war had drained into archives and the hangars of Guidonia were filled with dust instead of engines, Filippo Zapata could still recall the sound of those twin Allisons starting in harmony. He would tell his students that the war was not won in the skies above Europe, but on the factory floors of America, where precision became routine and abundance became doctrine. But in 1943, none of that was theory. It was a shock measured in revolutions per minute. Each day that the captured P-38 sat under the Roman sun, its silence seemed to grow heavier, as if the aircraft itself knew it had more to teach than its captors had time to learn. The engineers catalogued every fitting and fastener, every bearing and bushing, filling ledgers with sketches that would never become blueprints. They weighed bolts on scales that measured in fractions of a gram and found even the smallest pieces carried the same American message: strength without waste, tolerance without apology. Zapata had once believed genius could compensate for scarcity, that cleverness could fill the gaps left by a starved industry. The P-38 erased that illusion with a torque wrench. When the Italian Air Ministry reviewed his completed dossier, the generals praised the technical detail and ignored the conclusion. They saw the Lightning as a curiosity, a rare specimen to be admired and then forgotten. Zapata saw it as a forecast. He compared the production figures he had been allowed to see: Italy's 150 fighters per month, America's thousands, and understood that time itself had taken sides. Each American factory shift produced more horsepower than all of Lombardy. Each shipload of aluminum arriving in New York represented a future no Italian engine could reach. He read the reports from Sicily and Tunisia of P-38's escorting bombers all the way from Africa, and realized these aircraft were not operating at the edge of range. They were rewriting the map of what range meant. Guidonia's test flights confirmed the data beyond argument. The Lightning outclimbed everything at altitude, its turbochargers maintaining thrust as if the mountain air was sea level. Italian pilots accustomed to machines that gasped thinly above 20,000 feet watched in disbelief as the American fighter pulled away into thinner sky, its contrails drawing white lines that felt like verdicts. Zapata, standing on the runway with a clipboard clutched to his chest, could almost hear the mathematics shouting: horsepower versus drag, lift versus weight, metal versus morale. The numbers could be denied in speeches, but not in air battles. The more they examined, the more they saw a different kind of intelligence, engineering as an ecosystem. Every component existed not alone, but in conversation with every other. The turbocharger fed the intercooler, which protected the engine, which powered the propellers that cancelled each other's torque, which allowed the airframe to carry the heavier systems that in turn safeguarded the pilot. It was not one invention, but the coordination of hundreds. And that was the revelation Italy could not copy. You could steal a plane, you could not steal a system. To duplicate the Lightning, Italy would need to duplicate the society that built it, an ocean of suppliers, metallurgists, inspectors, logistics officers, and factory workers who could turn complexity into routine. That was America's secret weapon, and it had been hiding behind those engine cowlings all along. After Italy's surrender, the Lightning vanished from record, stripped for parts, burned, or buried under wreckage when the Germans retreated. But the report survived, a sheaf of typewritten pages that crossed the years like a confession. In the 1960s, when an aviation historian asked Zapata what he remembered most, he did not speak of fear or failure. He spoke of respect. "We built beauty," he said, "but they built endurance." Their engineers thought in millions of hours, not thousands of flights. He described the feeling of running his hand along the turbine housing, knowing he was touching something his nation could not yet imagine producing. "It wasn't just an engine," he said softly. "It was a calendar. Every revolution told me how many years ahead they were today. The lightning's legend survives in museums and documentaries. Its shape still unmistakable. Twin booms and a central pod. An aircraft that looked like it was born of contradiction and flew on certainty. But the real story is not about one plane's performance. It is about a moment when an engineer looked into a machine and saw the future of war, industry, and ambition." Filippo Zapata's discovery at Guidonia reminds us that technology is not just parts and patents. It is a mirror showing a nation what it values and what it can make real. The Americans built an airplane that could fly farther and faster because they had already built the world that could sustain it. And that world, once revealed, could not be unseen. Zapata's report was filed away, but its lesson endures. The next victory is already being built in the factories long before the first shot is fired. The P-38 Lightning was America's message in aluminum and fire, and every turn of its turbines whispered the same truth: industry wins wars. If stories like this fascinate you, where engineering and history collide to change the fate of nations, don't just stop here. Follow for more hidden chapters of aviation and the unseen minds who built the machines that shaped our world. By autumn 1943, the workshops of Guidonia were nearly silent. The bombing of Italian industrial centers had turned supply chains into riddles no one could solve. Spare parts arrived too late, or not at all, and the engineers spent more time salvaging than creating. Yet in the middle of that decay, one corner of the base still held a gleaming relic, the disassembled Lightning. Its parts were tagged, catalogued, and studied like fragments of a fallen meteor. Each component seemed to whisper of a civilization operating at another level of order. The bolts fit so precisely they could be reassembled without forcing. The electrical connectors clicked with mechanical grace. Even the wiring insulation seemed designed to last decades. "They build as if they expect to win," Mancini muttered one morning, holding a coil of copper wire between his fingers. Zapata didn't answer. He knew the truth was worse. The Americans built as if losing had never crossed their minds. Zapata's report spread quietly through Italy's engineering community. Copies were passed among senior designers at Fiat, Reggiane, and Macchi. Some read it with disbelief, others with grim admiration. One engineer annotated a margin with a question that captured their collective despair. If this is their present, what will their future look like? The answer arrived not in words, but in waves of bombers. P-38's began appearing over Italy not as test subjects, but as escorts, sleek guardians shepherding liberators and fortresses through flak and fighter defense. The same aircraft Zapata had touched on the Guidonia runway now roamed freely above, high and untouchable. He could almost identify the sound, a twin-engine rhythm he knew too well. Each time they passed overhead, the irony burned deeper. The Italians had been the first Axis power to see the Lightning up close, and it had been a preview of their own defeat. In early August, as the front lines disintegrated, Angelo Tondi's name resurfaced in military communiques. His test flight of the captured P-38 had been rewritten by propaganda officers into legend, the Italian ace who turned the enemy's weapon against them. Posters appeared in Rome showing Tondi beside the twin-tailed silhouette, slogans proclaiming Italian ingenuity triumphant over foreign arrogance. Zapata read those headlines with hollow eyes. The truth, the one that mattered, lay buried in the paragraphs no newspaper would print, the section of his report labeled Strategic Assessment. There he had spelled it out with the precision of a man signing his own surrender. If this aircraft represents the industrial capacity of the United States, Italy cannot sustain a competitive war. Every attempt to match technology without matching production will accelerate defeat. The document had been stamped, restricted, and filed away, but it had already predicted what history would confirm. When the armistice came in September, Guidonia fell into confusion. German forces occupied the field, stripping it of anything useful. Zapata stayed as long as he could, ensuring his notes and the P-38’s technical drawings were hidden before the occupation began. He watched as German engineers arrived, curious but dismissive. To them, the Lightning was an oddity, impressive but unnecessary. They had their own wonders, the Me-262 jets, the V-series rockets, and little interest in a foreign twin-engine fighter. Zapata said nothing. He had learned that some truths do not persuade until it is too late. Before leaving the airfield, he stood once more before the remains of the Lightning. Its wings had been removed, its engines crated, its fuselage resting on wooden blocks. Dust settled on the aluminum skin, muting the shine that had once reflected the Mediterranean sun. He reached out and placed a hand on the metal. "We built dreams," he whispered, "but they built inevitability." After the war, Italy's aviation industry limped into the New World Order. Reconstruction demanded practicality over pride. Fiat returned to building cars, and military projects shrank to licensed copies of Allied designs. In 1946, a young engineer approached Zapata during a post-war symposium in Turin. He had heard rumors about the captured Lightning and asked if the stories were true. Zapata smiled faintly. "True enough," he said, "but the important part wasn't the airplane." The student looked puzzled. "Then what was?" Zapata answered softly, "The realization that you can lose a war years before the first battle if you misunderstand what your enemy is capable of building." That understanding would shape Zapata's final years. When he lectured on propulsion design, he spoke less about thermodynamics and more about systems, how every invention lives or dies by the network that sustains it. He would show a slide of the Allison engine and ask his students to imagine not the metal, but the map behind it. The foundries, suppliers, railways, and workers synchronized in invisible harmony. A machine, he told them, is only as advanced as the civilization that can reproduce it at will. The P-38 had proved that beyond debate. In the archives, the Lightning's serial number remained attached to a brief entry. Captured intact, Guidonia, 1943. Destroyed, 1944. No photograph survived of its final state, but the story endured in testimonies and the quiet reverence of those who had seen it. To engineers, it became a parable of humility. To historians, a turning point. To Filippo Zapata, it was the day arithmetic defeated arrogance. Some nights, years later, when visitors asked if he ever regretted uncovering what he did, he would shake his head. "Regret? No," he said, "you can't regret seeing the truth. Only ignoring it." The Lightning had not humiliated him. It had educated him. It showed him that technology is never isolated brilliance. It is a language, and the Americans had become fluent while the rest of the world was still learning the alphabet. And that is why, even decades later, when Zapata was an old man walking the quiet corridors of an Italian aerospace museum, he would stop before the exhibit of post-war jet engines and smile faintly. Every turbine, every compressor blade, every alloy traced its lineage back to lessons first learned under that Roman sun. The Americans had forced Italy to look at itself not as a nation of artisans, but as part of a global industrial equation. It was a painful revelation, but it forged a new generation of engineers who would one day build aircraft that could finally stand beside their former rivals. The twin-boomed ghost of the P-38 lingered above them, a reminder that progress begins with honesty. If you've followed the story this far, you've seen how a single encounter with an enemy machine reshaped an entire nation's understanding of itself. To discover more forgotten chapters like this, where invention, ambition, and reality collide, subscribe and keep exploring the hidden machinery of history. When the post-war dust settled, Europe's factories hummed again, but to Zapata, the rhythm was different now. The clang of presses and the shriek of lathes no longer sounded like triumph. They sounded like lessons being learned in arrears. Italy's engineers, many of them veterans of those desperate years, worked with borrowed blueprints and allied licenses, reverse engineering progress that had already passed them by. Yet beneath the humiliation, there was resolve. The captured P-38 had not only exposed the gulf between Italian elegance and American excess, it had planted a seed. The men who had once studied the Lightning's engines now spoke a new language, of precision standards, interchangeable parts, statistical process control. They no longer designed merely to fly, they designed to be built. Zapata, reinstated briefly as a consultant for post-war aviation projects, carried with him the ghost of Guidonia. When young engineers crowded his office, asking about the Lightning, he would describe it without romance. It was not beautiful, he said, but it was complete. That is rarer. He taught them that the true miracle had not been horsepower or altitude. It had been reliability measured across thousands of machines. When every airplane performs the same, he explained, you no longer fight with luck. You fight with mathematics. His students wrote this down like scripture. They would later lead Italy's own advances in jet propulsion and civil aviation, but always with an echo of his warning, design is destiny only if your factories can keep up. The American archives declassified the Lightning's production figures in the 1950s, and when Zapata read them, he found his wartime estimates conservative. 10,000 P-38’s, 70,000 Allison engines. The numbers felt unreal, like counting stars. Yet they were proof of a truth he had felt the moment he opened those engine cowlings, that America had industrialized its imagination. In wartime photographs, he studied the assembly lines. Rows of women in coveralls riveting the same joint hundreds of times a day, each confident that precision was patriotic. It humbled him. In Italy, craftsmanship had been a matter of pride. In America, it had been democratized. Millions of hands had learned to make perfection ordinary. That was the secret weapon he had glimpsed but not named. In 1962, a journalist from Aviazione Oggi visited Zapata at his small apartment in Turin. They drank coffee while the reporter read excerpts from the original Guidonia report, yellowed and fragile. "You wrote," the man said, "this aircraft demonstrates a philosophy beyond our comprehension." What did you mean by that? Zapata looked out the window toward the industrial skyline. I meant that they build as though time were infinite, he said. Every component was designed not only for performance, but for repetition. They expected to make more of everything. We designed as though each plane were the last we might ever finish. The journalist asked if he still had a piece of the Lightning. Zapata shook his head. No, I didn't need a souvenir. The memory was enough. He smiled. Besides, the Americans already took the best parts, their ideas. In the decades that followed, His analysis became required reading in Italian aeronautical circles, not as a lament, but as a benchmark. The phrase La lezione del fulmine, the lesson of the lightning, entered engineering slang, shorthand for any project that demanded humility before complexity. When Italy began developing its first jet trainers in the 1950s, some of the same men who had disassembled the P-38 oversaw production. This time, determined that every bolt could be duplicated, every tolerance measured, every process taught. They no longer chased elegance alone. They chased repeatability. Zapata's quiet revolution had taken root, and yet, even as his professional legacy grew, the old engineer remained haunted by a single image. That June morning in 1943, the aluminum skin gleaming like liquid sunlight, the aircraft's shadow stretching across the tarmac like a prophecy. He could still feel the heat of the metal beneath his fingertips, hear the murmurs of his team as realization spread from one mind to the next. "We were proud," he once told a colleague, "until that day showed us what pride without power costs." It was not defeat that scarred him. It was awareness. Awareness that genius without industry is a bird with one wing. It may lift briefly, but it cannot sustain flight. As Italy's economy surged in the 1960s, building cars and turbines that finally rivaled their foreign counterparts, Zapata found cautious satisfaction. Perhaps, he thought, they had at last caught up to the lesson the lightning had delivered. On his final visit to an aircraft plant in Milan, he watched automated milling machines carve titanium compressor blades with precision once unimaginable. The factory foreman told him they could produce hundreds a month. Zapata smiled. "Then perhaps," he said, "we have learned to build inevitability too." The young workers had no idea what he meant, but they nodded respectfully. The name Filippo Zapata still carried weight. He retired quietly, his report preserved in the National Archives. Occasionally, a historian would visit, asking about the P-38. He would point to a small, framed photograph on his wall, the only surviving image of that captured lightning, its twin tails gleaming beneath the Roman sky. "That airplane was not just metal," he said softly. "It was a mirror." And when we looked into it, we saw the 20th century staring back. What began as a technical examination had become a parable about progress itself. Nations do not fall behind because they lack courage. They fall behind when they mistake craftsmanship for capacity, invention for infrastructure. Zapata's discovery proved that the line between genius and obsolescence is drawn by production lines, not drawing boards. If you've stayed with this story to the end, remember what he learned at Guidonia. The next revolution is already humming on someone's factory floor. Keep watching, keep learning, and follow for more stories where engineering changed not just machines, but the fate of entire nations. In his final years, Filippo Zapata lived quietly in a small house outside Turin, surrounded by notebooks filled with sketches of engines that were never built. His hands, once blackened by machine oil, now trembled slightly when he drew, but his mind remained sharp, locked forever in conversation with the ghost of that twin-tailed machine. He had outlived the war, the empire, and the generation that had believed craftsmanship alone could carry a nation. Sometimes he would sit on his balcony with the old report from 1943 spread across his lap, the paper brittle, but the numbers eternal. He would read the lines he had written in fear and realize they had aged into prophecy. The lightning had not been an aberration. It had been a glimpse into the logic of the modern world, where precision, production, and organization outweighed courage, artistry, and intuition. By the 1970s, young engineers from the Polytechnic Institute visited him to record interviews. They found him surrounded by model airplanes and stacks of technical journals, a relic of another century, but still speaking with the passion of a man who could see the invisible gears turning behind civilization. The P-38, he told them, wasn't extraordinary because of its power or beauty. It was extraordinary because it represented trust. Every mechanic who tightened a bolt trusted that the next man would do it the same way. That is how you win wars, and how you build peace afterward. When they asked if he thought Italy could ever achieve that level of technological unity, he smiled. "We have the talent," he said, "but talent must be multiplied, not admired." The Americans multiplied theirs. That's all. Zapata passed away quietly in 1979. The National Aeronautical Association marked his death with a modest notice that mentioned his wartime service and his contributions to post-war industry, but not the captured Lightning. Yet, among engineers, the story persisted. Copies of his Guidonia report circulated in universities, photocopied until the ink faded, a foundational text for anyone studying the intersection of design and industry. His conclusion, that the strength of a nation lies in the repeatability of its excellence, became a mantra for Italian manufacturing during the economic boom. Students quoted it as they built prototypes for new aircraft and turbines, knowing that each precise weld and standardized fitting was part of a legacy born from defeat. Across the Atlantic, in museums and air shows, gleaming restorations of the P-38 took to the skies again. Veterans gathered to watch them, their polished skins catching the sunlight like the day over Rome 3 decades earlier. To spectators, they were symbols of courage and victory. To those who knew Zapata's story, they were symbols of something deeper, the moment the modern age announced itself in metal and mathematics. Every time those twin engines roared to life, it was as if the past was whispering through the exhaust, reminding anyone listening that progress favors those who prepare for it long before they need it. In 1983, an aviation magazine published a retrospective titled "The Twin-Tailed Devil in Italian Hands." The final paragraph quoted Zapata from a 1965 interview. "When I opened those cowlings, I didn't just see 2 engines. I saw a nation that had already imagined the world we were still trying to invent." The article called the P-38 the most honest teacher Italy ever met. It ended with a single line that could have been written by Zapata himself. "Every generation finds its lightning, the machine that shows them who they are and who they are not yet today. The ruins of Guidonia's old test facilities still stand, their concrete runways cracked by weeds. Sometimes local historians and aviation enthusiasts walk the perimeter, imagining where the captured Lightning once rested. They find fragments of aluminum buried in the dirt, rivets, scraps of wiring, maybe pieces of the hangar roof, and hold them like relics. Each glinting shard carries a story of vision colliding with limitation, of one engineer's awakening to the scale of a world larger than he had dreamed. Somewhere in those ruins lies the spot where Zapata first touched the turbine that changed his life, the exact moment when defeat became enlightenment. The legacy of that discovery extends far beyond Italy. It stands as a reminder that every nation, every generation, eventually faces its own reckoning with the future, when ideals meet the machinery of reality. The P-38 Lightning was not just America's weapon, it was humanity's wake-up call, proof that mastery is measured not in brilliance alone, but in the to reproduce brilliance at will. Zapata's story endures because it captures a universal truth. The difference between admiration and understanding is action. To see, to build, to learn, these are the real victories. The legacy of that discovery extends far beyond Italy. It stands as a reminder that every nation, every generation, eventually faces its own reckoning with the future, when ideals meet the machinery of reality. The P-38 Lightning was not just America's weapon. It was humanity's wake-up call, proof that mastery is measured not in brilliance alone, but in the to reproduce brilliance at will. Zapata's story endures because it captures a universal truth. The difference between admiration and understanding is action. To see, to build, to learn. These are the real victories. And if you followed this story to its end, take a lesson from the man who saw the future inside an enemy's engine. Stay curious, stay humble, and never stop examining the machinery that drives the world forward. Subscribe for more stories where forgotten discoveries reveal how innovation, courage, and the quiet persistence of engineers have shaped history itself.